All right, well, there's no time like the present to get started. This is a slight shift in chapter 4. Nothing major, nothing crazy, but I mean, it's just a kind of a shift. We were looking at how the origins of the Japanese worldview established the Edo period. Now we're looking at the actual running of Japanese society under the Edo period, under the Bakufu and the samurai lords that followed the Bakufu and the shogun. So, this section here is all about the Edo period, representing, the desires of the shogun, the way that he wanted to run things. I don't feel bad even saying he, because at that point in time it was a he. Just as another aside, I love Japan is on my bucket list of things to do before I die, and going and seeing these castles in Japan just ranks really high on my list because I think they're just absolutely stunning architecture. So this is all about control. This whole video is going to be the shogun's will to control, and so everything in here is just about the shogun going and asserting his dominance over the society. So there's levels of authority at all times, right? Like I talked about there being in the previous video, there being the queen for Canada, who technically is the head authority, but she's a figurehead. And then there's the prime minister, and then there are the premiers of each province. That's kind of what we're talking about here. We're not really going to worry about the emperor so much, but what we are going to do is we're going to look at the shogun and his military army, his military government called the Bakufu. And then we're going to look at so they're the top level of authority, and then we're going to look at the level below them, which is the daimyo lords, which are like the premiers of each province. So all these rules are put in place to make sure that no daimyo can become too powerful. Okay, so that is the great fear of the Bakufu. The Bakufu fear someone else becoming as powerful as them. And so the Bakufu puts in a whole bunch of rules, or the shogun puts in a whole bunch of rules to prevent that. So all of these rules here, these laws for the Bakufu or for the daimyo lords, are there just to make sure that no one can become too powerful. So like this first one, not too much contact between you and your neighbor. That's because you could form an alliance. And again, if you're the shogun and you want to maintain power, you don't want anyone to be getting friends and to be creating alliances, because two powerful daimyos could overrule the shogun at some point in time if they get their power, if they get their ducks in a row. So the next one, only one castle, and the daimyo must provide detailed maps of their land holdings. So again, if you have more than one castle, then you have more than one fortified and defendable position. And again, the shogun does not want that, or the Bakufu, which is again his military government, doesn't want that. So in this situation, we're looking at making sure that no one is too strong to be attacked by the military government, or by the government's military. Support public funding projects. This is to keep your daimyos, make sure that their money isn't gathering, so they have to do certain projects. This one here, daimyo lords are required to spend every second year in Edo. This is a really important thing, because what it actually means is that they have to, spend money to bring all of their entourage to Edo, and that would be quite large. But it also means that every other year they're either in their home province or they're in Edo underneath the thumb of the Bakufu. And if the Bakufu has their thumb on them for half their time, they're going back and forth every other year, then the Bakufu can really, manage their affairs and make sure that they're not doing things that they don't want them to do. So this is a great thing for them. It also means that they have to keep a house in Edo and keep people there. And so again, there is a level of control that the Bakufu can exert over the daimyo lords that is quite amazing. The next really important two is this one here, are these two here. No marriages unless given permission. Again, one of the ways that we talked about in the past during the Renaissance of establishing new relationships was through marriage. And so if you could get a son of one daimyo to marry the daughter of another daimyo, they're then tied together. We saw that with Ferdinand and Isabella. They combined forces and were able to repel or kick out the Moors from the Iberian Peninsula. So this is the Bakufu trying to prevent the union of different daimyos through marriage. And the last one, traveling and shipbuilding are restricted. Like, it's just fishing boats. So all these laws, again, are there just for the daimyo to be controlled by the Bakufu. So this is talking about that same thing I was kind of talking about. They had to keep a house in both places. So here, this is the Bakufu had great power over the daimyo. Yada, yada, yada. It also created laws that made it impossible for the daimyo to form alliances among themselves to gain enough money to become powerful enough to threaten the shogun. So this is really important. There's going to be another video, kind of like the one I put out last week. That is about this whole thing. So this is really cool and really scary at the same time. So the hierarchical class structure is really important for them. And as you read through your textbook this week, and you get to this shogun, of course, is the leader of the entire country. He's the one that has real power. He's the one that runs the government. Samurai are hereditary warriors. Some samurai were daimyo. Well, all daimyo were samurai. Some samurai were powerful enough to be daimyo lords and run an area. Then there were farmers. Now, farmers are an interesting thing because usually farmers are pretty low on the totem pole, but because the shogun set up koku, which is rice, as the currency for how taxes are paid, the farmers actually become very important in the economy because they're literally growing the money. Now, they are destitute. They are ridiculously poor, but they are very important. They're essential workers, to use our modern terminology. Artisans, people who made, like, if you look at artisans, art is in the beginning of it right there. So these are craftsmen that make stuff. Merchants were the sellers of the things the artisans made. Now we get down to these bottom two, and I'll go into these a little bit more later on. The outcast, or the eta, were people that carried out jobs that didn't fit the Buddhist lifestyle. So these guys had jobs that kind of put them on the outs, but they were still a class above the hinin, or the non-humans. Now, these guys here, super interesting. And not that they were always the most outcast people. There are people that fit into the non-human category that still were serving a purpose inside of Japanese culture, but these guys, for the most part, are the lowest of the low. When you hear the story of samurais being allowed to go out and test their samurai sword, they're buying a new sword and they want to test it. This is what they were technically, by law, allowed to test it on, because the killing of a non-human wasn't actually a big deal. So that's one of those rumors or stories that were told. So, anyways. We'll get back in. Each of these classes has a block of text kind of discussing or describing what their lifestyle was like. Now, there's a big problem for the samurai, where once they were like the warriors that ran the show and protected and conquered and all that kind of stuff, in the latter part of the Edo period, because it's 260, I think Ella said it was 264 years or whatever it was, of peace, the samurai eventually aren't actually all that useful for fighting wars and maintaining the peace when the entire society is no longer at war. So for the samurai, they eventually have to find new roles. And the samurai class actually is really important when we come out of the Edo period. It's lunchtime here. They become very important once we come out of the Edo period because they eventually are the ones that are leading the charge towards reintegration into the world, because they are doing some of the background work of the civil court and of the country. They are also learning to read and do all those kinds of things because of the nature of their new jobs that they have. I already talked about farmers. This basically is covering more of what I said earlier on there. So they were broken up into two groups. One that owned the land, and the other ones were the poorer farmers. So you can read this, but these guys literally ran the economy. Artisans should make sense, and merchants should make sense. The outcasts, again, the primary reason why they didn't fit into society as a whole is because they were touching dead bodies. And the Buddhist belief system says that dead bodies are dirty, I guess. I don't know. But they were shunned by society and they had to be called in. So if someone died, if a family member died, they would call the Eta in to come and remove the corpse and deal with that, so that the people inside of the house didn't have to do that. The people that were actually, part of normal society. And then we get down here to the non-humans. This one here is really interesting because there are some non-humans that we'll talk about a little later on, like geishas, that fit in here, and there's entire troops of traveling musicians and putting up plays and those kinds of things that were viewed and loved by even the samurai and everyone else. But because they were not living inside of the norms of society, they were considered non-humans. So it's very interesting. These guys, I find this whole, because of him were looked down as non-human, the killing of him would not be considered murder. I find that crazy and interesting and those kinds of things. But it's worthwhile looking into if you find this very interesting. And so one of the things that I would normally be doing right now is there's a book called Shipwrecked that I would normally read with my classes. It's very interesting and it's really good, and it kind of goes through an actual person living inside of the Edo period and their experiences, and for each of these, the kind of fabric you could wear, the number of stitches, the kind of toys your kids were allowed to buy. There were rules for everything inside of each of those social classes. And if you were found to be breaking those rules, you could be charged and punished. So we're going to carry on. Now, cities change a lot during this time. And the Japanese, one of the main driving forces I talked about earlier was the Japanese would travel from city to city. With the daimyo lords having to go to Edo every year, there were major road networks, and kind of like what happens, between here and Edmonton, there are logical waypoints that you stop. And basically each of the distances that you would look at here is the distance that you can travel in a day. So whatever the distance a person could travel in a day, there would be a waypoint at the end of that day's travel. And so if you want to think about it, between here and Edmonton, there are some very natural waypoints. And, today, being a parent that drives my, children around, the natural waypoints for me are actually bathroom breaks. When my kids were younger, it was every hour we had to stop to use the bathroom. And so, you'd be able to make it to Valley View, and then you'd pull all your kids out and they'd use the washroom, you put them all back in, and then we'd maybe make it to Fox Creek or somewhere along there, and then you'd pull all the kids out, they'd use the bathroom, you put them back in. Very similar thing, only it's just a day's travel is what the distances were between cities. But every day's travel, there would be a city that would pop up, and there would be the opportunity for people to create shops and other things that that fill the needs of the traveling daimyo lords and samurai. So they eventually set up a whole bunch of major centers as well. And I don't feel like I need to spend a crazy amount of time. The most important ones, of course, are Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto are the other major ones. You might recognize some other names on here, like Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed during World War II. And these are the main islands, Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu, that are fitting into the Japanese archipelago there. So the three main cities each had their jobs inside of society. And I'm not going to read all of this. You can read through it and see all of that. But each of those cities had their own jobs and their own like things that they kind of were responsible for making and doing. Osaka was the storehouse for rice. So there's lots of different things. There's lots of different things that fit each of those different cities. So I'm going to cut this one off here. And there'll be one more this week, so I'll see you guys in a little bit.